climate activism right now. So the urgency doesn't, so that's one level of unthinkability. We're so embedded in this life, it's almost impossible to think otherwise. So we might think of this as a political unthinkability, as an inability to have the imaginative reach to accept that something is happening, along with an inability to accept that we could live in such a way. So, now I think there's definitely something of this exercise in the limits of our political imagination in post-apocalyptic cinema. The more we witness the destruction of the world in post-apocalyptic cinema, and it's always the first world, right? The genocide of the Indigenous Australian people is not the end of the world, right? That's what you needed to have this world, right? So the end of the world is always Manhattan, sometimes LA, occasionally London. I think 28 Days Later shows you a little bit of the Eiffel Tower. There's a frozen Sydney Opera House, but it's pretty much Manhattan, right? It's not Nebraska, right? It's not Lincoln, Nebraska. You'll be happy to know Lincoln, Nebraska is not the end of the world. This place ends, right? It's not the end of the world, so it's okay. So there can be a tragic witnessing of the destructions of cities and worlds, but always with the redemptive conclusion that the world has been saved. So a classic motif of post-apocalyptic cinema is to see Shanghai blown to the ground, definitely Middle East, that can go. You see some sort of vague image of Africa, Asians, inscrutable Asians, they can all go. And the world is saved. It's lamentable, but it's not the end of the world, right? So, and eventually some pocket of the world has been saved, usually Manhattan. There is almost something phenomenological about post-apocalyptic cinema. How much can we imagine losing that would be short of the end of the world, right? And in some cases it's extreme. In a film I'll be talking about, I Am Legend, there's basically one little bit of humanity left in New Hampshire, right? That's the pocket at the end of the world. And but it's still seen as the humanity was saved, right? Because there was some Americans left. Not that I've got anything against Americans, just like to point that out. Don't want my citizenship revoked. Now here's the point I want to make about this logic. I want to claim that it is endemic to post-apocalyptic cinema, but that it actually characterises what's left of philosophy in the world today. And to make this case, I want to refer to the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. So it's a funded institute at Oxford University led by the philosopher Nick Bostrom, who argues that we think that catastrophes such as the Holocaust are major existential catastrophes. And he's not saying it wasn't bad. He's saying, but ultimately, look, we recovered. There's the state of Israel and humanity goes on. What we should really be focused on is not these genocides in which humanity survives, but humanity as such. And that's what the Future of Humanity Institute is dedicated to, is saving what he refers to as intelligence and technological maturity. So on that logic, it would be sad if, let's say, all of Australia were wiped out, right? But humanity as such would survive. However, it would be absolutely catastrophic. The difference between that and the destruction of technology as we know it is much greater, right? And governments need to focus on that. So this is a highly funded, philosophically central think tank that repeats the logic of post-apocalyptic cinema. You can watch a lot of destruction, it's lamentable, but as long as you save humanity, there's a moment of triumph. So here's back to post-apocalyptic cinema. But my claim is, I'm talking about post-apocalyptic cinema, but it really expresses what I would refer to as a logic of the end of the world and humanity. Post-apocalyptic cinema is profoundly majoritarian. Beginning with the end form of our existence, how we are now, we play thought experiments with what we might be able to change, and it seems that we can lament the loss of many worlds. We can watch Shanghai, Sydney fall to the ground, but we cannot think that there's anything other than this world. So we're very happy to entertain mass destruction, but we're not able to contemplate that there could be a world other than the one we have. There's an often quoted phrase, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think that's the most stupid thing that ever got re-quoted. Because actually when you look at end of world films, they are just the end of capitalism. Capitalism's gone, right? And it might as well be the end of the world. We're left in a condition of mere subsistence. We're left in the way that most humans have lived. Without TV, without the state, without taxation, without the police force, right? So you remove capitalism, it's the end of the world. So the majoritarian form, and what I also want to argue is that usually the end of the world is usually imagined as the end of cinema, not in the narrow sense of like movie theatres, because they all probably are gone, but the humanity that must be saved is a humanity that's connected to the globe, right? So as long as you have mass media, internet, television, radio, the control room in Washington DC that is capable of viewing the globe, the world still exists. But the minute you have humans that are just making a living off a farm and have no clue what's happening in Australia or Britain or what's left of the European Union, that might as well be the end of the world. So what I want to argue is that it's unthinkable, right? Not just, so there's the unthinkability of we can't imagine that this is going to go, but a more profound unthinkability, we can't imagine what it's like to be human without that cinematic conception of the world, that in order to exist, I have to be able to turn on the TV and see what, or not in America you don't turn on the TV and see what's happening. Anywhere else in the world you turn on the TV and you see what's happening everywhere else in the world. Here you see what's happening in Congress. But anywhere else, right, to be human is to have a global sensibility, right, that's enabled by technology. So I'm arguing that we should think about unthinkability not in terms of how much we are prepared to sacrifice in order to survive, but this. How much of our survival requires that we do not think? That's my question, right? That we are so embedded in the way we are now that we can't think about what goes into the cost of that cinematic comportment to the world. So we're so attached, or we so define humanity according to its capacity to have a global sensibility that without that we can't think of what being human would be. It's my go-to example, but I think it's very compelling. Legally, Australia was defined as terra nullius, unoccupied land. When white settlers got there, those same white settlers that said that humans weren't there painted these human bodies that weren't human. But if you looked at the way they were painted in the same way that Joshua Reynolds painted cattle. Right? They were just in the environment, right? They didn't have a world, right? They didn't have books then, right? They didn't seem to be building anything. So that it's unthinkable for us that that would be human. Okay. So that's the unthinkable. I'm suggesting that we begin to think about what our media cost us and cost the world. And most of our media is cinematic, including our books, right? Ever since the 18th century, novels have been a way of composing a world. Not in that way. Okay, here's the third section. What would you do and who would you kill in order to save the world? So I'm going to go through a brief, this is my sort of one academic moment in this talk, which is meant to be academic, but this is where I actually quote someone of worth and lustre. In a recent book on animals, the philosopher Christine Korsgaard puts forward an argument about how we value lives and whether some lives have more value than others. I mean, this is the standard thing we do in order to eat meat, right? A human life is more valuable than an animal life. I happen to be a vegetarian, I'm not an animal activist, that's not where this is going. But her claim is, and I think she's writing about animals, but I think it's far more interesting in terms of humans, right? She claims no life has an absolute value. No life has an absolute value. A human life has more value than an animal life for us, but that's because we're human, right? So if I say, why do you value human lives? And I say, well, we can appreciate Beethoven, we read novels, we have morality, right? And that's why we value our lives above an animal's. But she makes the claim, well, those are